My father always told me that a man's word is his bond, but he waited until he was in a casket to prove his own bond was made of smoke. I'm Arthur. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 24 years serving in the military. I've survived deployments, hard winters, and the even harder struggle of coming out in 2006 to a family that valued tradition over truth. I thought the battle was over, but my father had one last order to give from the grave. When his will was read, it was a public execution. He wrote, "I have left nothing to my son, whom I love dearly. He will be adequately provided for by the estate of his mother." He bypassed me entirely, handing $400,000 to my ex-wife and daughters just to ensure my husband would never see a dime of his bloodline money. He thought he was protecting a legacy. He didn't realize he was starting a war. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because this is about what happens when you decide to stop being the provider who gets kicked in the teeth and start being the man who balances the scales. My father used his will as a weapon of disapproval. I'm about to use mine as a shield. Let me tell you how I handled the fallout. I spent 24 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. In the military, you learn that everything depends on the chain of command and the reliability of the man standing next to you. I lived my life by those rules. For over 2 decades, I played the part of the dutiful son, the dedicated soldier, and the ideal family man. I married Diane in 1986, and we had 2 daughters. I did everything I was supposed to do. I bought the house in Halifax. I worked the long hours, and I kept my true self locked away in a small, dark corner of my mind, because I knew my father wouldn't have tolerated anything less than normal. My father was a man of the old school, rigid, proud, and obsessed with the family name. Throughout my adulthood, he made one thing very clear. I was his only child, and everything he built would eventually be mine. "Arthur," he'd say over a glass of scotch, "you're the one who carries the torch. When I'm gone, this estate is your foundation." I believed him. I made financial decisions based on that promise. I invested in my daughter's education and my own career, thinking my retirement was secured by the inheritance he spoke of so often. Then came 2006. At 42 years old, I realized I couldn't live a lie for another second. I came out, and eventually, Diane and I divorced. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. A few years later, I met David. We've been married for 12 years now. David has been my rock, standing by me through the transition from military to civilian life, and through the cold silence that often came from my father. My father never yelled. He was more surgical than that. He simply treated David like a ghost. He would invite me to dinner, but not him. He would ask about my life, but ignore the person I shared it with. I thought his disapproval was something I had already paid for with the years of tension we endured. I thought that as long as I remained a good son in every other capacity, the promises he made about the estate still stood. I didn't realize that in my father's mind, I hadn't just changed my life. I had committed a breach of contract. He saw my husband as an intruder who didn't belong in the bloodline. He spent his final decade smiling to my face while quietly rewriting the ending to my story. The funeral was held on a crisp gray morning in Halifax. I stood there in my dress blues, shoulders back, providing the same stoic presence I had shown at dozens of military ceremonies. I handled the arrangements. I greeted the distant cousins from the UK who hadn't called my father in decades. I was the grieving son, the anchor for my daughters, and the executor of the family's public image. Throughout the service, I felt a strange sense of peace. I thought my father and I had reached a silent understanding. We hadn't agreed on my life, but we were still family. The peace lasted exactly 2 hours. After the burial, we gathered in the office of his longtime attorney, a man named Miller who had known my father for 40 years. Diane was there, sitting with our 2 adult daughters. David sat beside me, his hand resting briefly on my arm before he pulled it away, sensing the formal chill in the room. Miller cleared his throat and opened a heavy manila folder. "Your father was very specific about his final wishes," Miller said, refusing to meet my eyes. He began to read, and for the first minute, it was standard legal jargon. Then, he reached the section regarding the primary estate, the $400,000 in liquid assets, and the property value. Miller stopped and took a breath. "I am quoting directly from the text now," he wrote. "I have left nothing to my son, whom I love dearly. He will be adequately provided for by the estate of his mother. My primary assets are to be divided in 4 equal shares." The room went completely silent. I felt like I had been hit by a flashbang. My ears were ringing, and the air seemed to leave my lungs. I looked at the paper in Miller's hand. "I love dearly." The words were a mockery. He had used a term of affection to twist the knife. He was telling the world that his love didn't include his respect or his legacy. "4 shares?" I managed to ask. My voice sounded like it was coming from deep underwater. "Yes," Miller replied. 25% each to your daughters, 25% to Diane, and the final 25% to be split among your cousins in Manchester." I looked over at Diane. She didn't look surprised. She looked down at her lap, her face a mask of pity that felt more insulting than a slap. And my daughters looked at me with a mix of shock and something else, a dawning realization of their own new wealth. My father had effectively treated me like a stranger. He had reached past me, the person who had cared for him through his final illness, to hand his life's work to an ex-wife I had divorced 16 years ago, and cousins who wouldn't have known his middle name. "Is there a reason?" David asked, his voice steady even as mine failed. Miller sighed and looked at the wall. The letter of intent mentioned his desire to see the bloodline secured. He expressed concern that assets left to Arthur might eventually be redirected outside the immediate family unit. The message was clear. Because I was married to a man, my father didn't consider my household part of his bloodline. He was punishing me for my husband's existence, and he was using his final act on earth to tell me that my life was a mistake he refused to fund. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen of our home, staring at the shadows on the wall, while the tactical part of my brain, the part that had spent decades planning logistics and assessing threats, began to take over. My father's words kept looping in my head like a faulty recording. Adequately provided for by the estate of his mother. It was a brilliant, calculated lie. My mother had passed away in 1999. Her estate consisted of a modest life insurance policy and some jewelry, most of which had already been liquidated to pay for my daughter's weddings and down payments years ago. There was nothing left. My father knew that. By including that sentence, he wasn't being helpful. He was providing himself with a moral alibi. He wanted the world to think he wasn't being cruel, just fair. Around 3 a.m., I pulled out the file Miller had given me. I needed to see the dates. I needed to know exactly when the cracks in our foundation had become terminal. I discovered that the will had been amended in 2012, the same year David and I got married. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct response. My father had watched me exchange vows with the man I loved, and his immediate reaction was to walk into a lawyer's office and strike my name from his legacy. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. As a soldier, You're taught to expect the enemy to strike, but you're never truly prepared for the betrayal to come from the man who taught you how to march. I started looking into the feasibility of contesting the will. I spent hours on my laptop, researching probate law in Nova Scotia. The grounds for contesting are narrow: lack of capacity, undue influence, or a failure to provide for dependents. I wasn't a dependent. I was a 62-year-old retired veteran with a pension. Legally, my father had every right to be a bigot with his money. The investigation took a turn the following afternoon when my phone started buzzing. It was Diane. She wanted to meet for coffee. I didn't want to see her, but the military in me demanded I face the situation head on. We met at a small cafe near the waterfront. "Arthur," she started, her voice soft and patronizing, "I want you to know that I didn't ask for this. I was as surprised as you were." "Were you?" I asked. I watched her hands. She was fidgeting with a napkin. "Because you didn't look surprised in Miller's office. You looked like you were waiting for the check to clear." She winced. "Look, I know you're hurting, and I agree that what your father did was extreme. I talked to the girls. We don't want a long, drawn-out court battle. It would be bad for everyone. Miller says you might try to tie up probate for years, so I've decided to offer you a settlement. I'll give you $20,000 from my share. No strings attached. Just an acknowledgement that the estate is settled." I stared at her. $20,000. My father's estate was worth $400,000. Her share was $100,000. She was offering me a 20% pity tax to go away quietly. Before I could respond, my phone chimed. It was a notification from my banking app. A deposit had been made, $10,000. I opened the app and saw the note attached to the transfer, and it was from my eldest daughter, Sarah. It read, "Happy early birthday, Dad. We know Grandpa was being difficult. Hope this helps compensate for the trouble. Love you." I felt a wave of nausea. They were buying me off. My ex-wife and my children had held a meeting behind my back and decided on a price for my dignity. They were the beneficiaries of my disinheritance, and they were using the very money stolen from me to compensate me for the theft. It was the ultimate humiliation. In their eyes, I wasn't a man who had been wronged. I was a problem to be solved with a few wire transfers. "Is this what I'm worth to you all?" I asked Diane. $30,000 and a happy birthday note? "Arthur, be reasonable," she said. "You have your military pension. You have David's income. You don't need the money like the girls do for their mortgages. This is just a way to keep the family together." I realized then that they didn't see the parallel. They didn't see that by taking the money, they were validating my father's choice. They were accepting the spoils of his war against my identity and then tossing me the scraps so they wouldn't have to feel guilty while they spent the rest. I stood up, leaving my coffee untouched. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I walked out of that cafe and back to my car, my mind already shifting from grief to strategy. They thought the scales were balanced because they had thrown some cash at the wound. They had no idea that I was about to redraw the entire map. An engineer builds, a soldier defends. I was going to do both. I spent the next 48 hours doing what any good officer does before a counterstrike. I gathered intelligence. If I was going to rewrite my legacy, I needed to understand exactly what I was protecting and exactly what my daughters had already gained. I sat in my home office and pulled up my own financial records. Over the years, through disciplined saving and smart investments following my military retirement, I had built a significant estate. My house in Halifax was now valued at $650,000, and my liquid assets, including my supplemental retirement funds, totaled nearly $1.2 million. I looked at the numbers on the screen. For years, I had intended to split this equally between my two daughters. I wanted them to have the security I had worked so hard to build. But as I stared at the data, the $10,000 compensation check from my daughter Sarah kept flashing in my mind like a warning light. I began to look deeper into my father's personal correspondence, which I had retrieved from his study. I found a series of letters between my father and my eldest daughter dating back to 2018. In them, my father was shockingly transparent. He wrote to her about his fears regarding David. "I don't want the house and the savings I've spent 60 years accumulating to end up in the hands of a stranger," he had written. "If I leave it to Arthur, it eventually goes to David. I've decided to skip a link in the chain to keep the bloodline secure. You girls are the future of this family." My daughter's response wasn't one of protest. She hadn't defended me. She had written back, "I understand, Grandpa. We'll make sure your legacy stays where it belongs." There it was. Evidence of the bloodline pact. My daughters hadn't been innocent bystanders to my father's cruelty. They had been active participants in the conversation. They knew for years that I was being cut out. They sat across from me at Christmas dinners and birthday parties, knowing that they were the links chosen to replace me. The $10,000 check wasn't an apology. It was hush money to keep the $100,000 they each stood to gain from the estate moving through probate without a fight. I pulled up a fresh spreadsheet. I titled it, "The Balance of Scales." I calculated the total windfall my daughters were receiving from my father, $100,000 each in cash, plus the eventual sale of his property. Then I added the $20,000 Diane was receiving. In total, the bloodline side of my past was being enriched by nearly $500,000 at my direct expense. I realized then that my daughters didn't see me as a father to be respected. They saw me as a financial hurdle that had been successfully cleared. They felt adequate because they were already holding the bag. They assumed that because I was 62 and stable, they could take my father's money now and wait for my money later. They were counting on my military sense of duty to keep me providing for them, even as they profited from my humiliation. I felt a strange, cold sense of relief. The decision wasn't hard anymore. In the military, if a bridge is compromised, you don't try to walk across it. You find a new route. My daughters had chosen their side. They had aligned themselves with a man who used money to punish my identity. It was time for me to align myself with the person who had actually stood in the trenches with me. I closed the spreadsheet and picked up the phone to call my lawyer. It was time to draft a new set of orders. I didn't go back to Miller. He was my father's man, and I needed someone who saw the world through my lens. I made an appointment with a woman named Elena Vance, an estate specialist known for her no-nonsense approach to complex family dynamics. I arrived at her office at 900 sharp, carrying a briefcase containing my financial life and a copy of my father's will. Elena looked over the documents with the practiced eye of a field medic assessing a wound. She read my father's "love dearly" clause and let out a short, dry laugh. "This is a classic poison pill strategy, Arthur," she said. "He wanted to disinherit you while looking like a saint. It's emotionally manipulative, even if it is legally sound." "I'm not here to fight him anymore," I told her, sitting straight in the leather chair. "He's gone, and he's made his choice. I'm here to make mine. I want to rewrite my will from the ground up." Elena leaned back. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I want to ensure my husband David is fully protected," I said. My father's primary fear was that David would touch a cent of his money. Well, David is my family. He is the person who took care of me when the military didn't, and when my father wouldn't. I want David to receive my house in Halifax and 70% of my liquid assets. Elena began taking notes, her pen scratching rhythmically against the pad. And the remaining 30%? I want it to go to Canadian veterans charities, I said. Specifically those focusing on PTSD and transitional housing. Those are the men and women I actually have a bond with. Those are the people who understand the cost of service. And your daughters? Elena asked, looking up. Usually a client in your position leaves a significant portion to their children to avoid a challenge later on. No, I said. My voice was cold, like a winter morning in the Atlantic. They have already been adequately provided for. They took $100,000 each of what should have been my inheritance. They accepted a payoff to validate my father's disapproval of my life. In my mind, they've already received their windfall. They just got it from the wrong generation. You realize this will cause a rift, Elena warned. Leaving a symbolic allocation, say $10,000 each, is often seen as a final statement of exclusion. It's not exclusion, I corrected her. It's a balance of scales. My father wanted to protect the bloodline? Fine. The bloodline is currently sitting on $400,000 of my family's wealth. My wealth. The wealth I built as a gay man, the wealth I built with David, belongs to the life I actually lived, not the lie I was forced to maintain for 40 years. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the logistics. We discussed trusts, survivor benefits, and the specific wording needed to make the will bulletproof against a challenge. I felt a weight lifting off my chest with every paragraph we drafted. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't the target of someone else's orders. I was the commanding officer of my own future. I'll have the final documents ready for signature by Friday, Elena said as I stood to leave. Good, I replied. I have a trip to Toronto to see my first grandchild next week. I'd like to have my affairs in order before I face my family. I walked out of the office and into the Halifax sun. My father thought he could use money to control me from beyond the grave. He was wrong. He had only succeeded in teaching me exactly how to use my own resources to protect the people who actually loved me back. The trip to Toronto was supposed to be a celebration of a new life, my first grandchild. But in a family where money has been used as a yardstick for love, there is no such thing as a pure celebration. I arrived at my eldest daughter Sarah's house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. The first thing I noticed was the new SUV in the driveway. The second thing I noticed was the designer nursery furniture being delivered as I stepped out of the cab. My father's $100,000 was already being put to work. Dinner that first night was a master class in awkwardness. Sarah and her sister Megan were both there. They were riding the high of their new inheritance, talking about kitchen renovations and vacation properties. They treated me with a sort of gentle pity, the way you'd treat a wounded animal that was finally house-trained. "Dad?" Megan said, topping off my wine glass. "We've been thinking. Since you have the settlement from Mom and the check from Sarah, maybe you should think about downsizing your place in Halifax. You don't need all that space, and it would free up more for your retirement." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. I'm 62, Megan. I think I can manage my own housing situation. "We're just worried about you," Sarah added, leaning in. "Grandpa's will was a shock, but in a way, it's a blessing. It's helped us get ahead while we're young. And we know you'll be fine. You've always been so disciplined." "Disciplined," I repeated. The word felt like lead in my mouth. Is that what we're calling it? I was disciplined enough to be the only child to care for him for 10 years, while he planned to leave me with nothing. I was disciplined enough to take your compensation checks, while you three split the estate I was promised for 40 years. The table went quiet. Sarah looked at Megan. Dad, don't be like that. We didn't write the will. Grandpa wanted to make sure his grandbabies were set. Is it so wrong that we accepted it? It's not the acceptance that bothers me, I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous military register. It's the entitlement. You speak as if you earned this by simply existing in the bloodline. You speak as if I am an auxiliary character in your financial story. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Diane. She had heard about the tension at dinner. Arthur, stop it, she hissed through the line. The girls are happy. For once, they have some breathing room. Why do you have to ruin this with your bitterness? You always had a chip on your shoulder about your father, but this is about the kids now. It was always about the kids, Diane, I said. That was the excuse. But the reality is that you all profited from his bigotry. You took the payout he offered for my silence. It was a gift. Arthur. A gift from a man who wanted to see his family taken care of. If you keep this up, you're going to push them away. Is that what you want? To be the bitter old man who has nobody but David? I have David, I said firmly. And unlike the rest of you, David doesn't require a $100,000 down payment to show me respect. I hung up, but the pressure didn't stop. Over the next 2 days, the girls kept making small, passive-aggressive comments about planning for the future and how lucky they were that the family wealth was staying in the family. They were already spending my estate in their heads. They assumed that because my father had bypassed me, my only job now was to accumulate as much as possible to pass down to them later. They saw me as a temporary holding cell for their eventual millions. They didn't realize that the chip on my shoulder was actually a tactical repositioning. They thought I was following the old orders. They had no idea that I had already signed the new ones. They were so busy counting my father's money that they hadn't noticed I was already moving mine out of their reach. The escalation reached its breaking point on Sunday afternoon during a walk in Hyde Park. Sarah started talking about legacy, and that's when I decided it was time for the demolition to begin. We were walking through Hyde Park, the autumn leaves crunching under our boots. Sarah was pushing the stroller, her face glowing with the kind of confidence only a sudden influx of cash can provide. She started talking about the future, not just her own, but mine. Dad, she said, her voice light and casual. We were talking about your estate the other day. Now that Grandpa's money is settled, we want to make sure your own will is as airtight as his was. We'd be happy to help you find a newer lawyer in Toronto to review everything. We just want to make sure the transition is smooth for the girls when the time comes. I stopped walking. I turned to look at her, the wind from the lake biting at my neck. You don't need to worry about my will, Sarah. I've already taken care of it. I visited Elena Vance in Halifax last week. Sarah smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, good. So you've got it all sorted for us. It's a relief to know you're thinking ahead. I am thinking ahead, I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, steady tone I used before a major briefing. And since you're so concerned with transparency, I should tell you the details. I have altered my will significantly. 70% of my liquid assets and the full value of the house in Halifax are going to David. The stroller stopped moving. Sarah's smile vanished. What did you say? The remaining 30%, I continued, ignoring her shock, is being donated to Canadian veterans' charities. I've already set up the trust. I want to make sure the men and women I served with are taken care of. What about us? Sarah's voice rose, attracting the attention of a passing jogger. What about me and Megan? What about your grandson? You and Megan will receive a small symbolic allocation, I said, $10,000 each, exactly the amount you sent me to compensate for my father's cruelty. I thought it was a fitting number, since you both were so comfortable with the bloodline being adequately provided for by my father's estate. I decided to follow his lead. You can't be serious, she hissed. You're leaving the bulk of your wealth to David? He's not part of the family, Dad. He's just someone you met later in life. He is the man who stood by me when my own father treated me like a disease, I replied. And unlike you, he didn't wait for a death certificate to decide I was worth his loyalty. Sarah stood there, her face contorting with a mix of rage and disbelief. The trap had been sprung. She had spent weeks counting my money, and I had just shown her that the account was closed. Sarah's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. She let go of the stroller handle and stepped toward me, her voice shaking. Dad, look at what you're doing. You're doing the exact same thing Grandpa did to you. You're using your will to punish us. Don't you see the parallel? You're being just as cruel and small-minded as he was. No, I told her, my voice as cold as the North Atlantic. It's not the same. Not even close. How is it not the same? She screamed. You're cutting out your own flesh and blood for a charity and a man who isn't even a Walsh. You're throwing away our family's future because you're bitter about a dead man's choices. I am not punishing you, Sarah, I said, stepping closer until she had to look up at me. I am balancing the scales. You and Megan didn't just receive an inheritance. You were the beneficiaries of my disinheritance. You saw my father strip me of my dignity and 40 years of promises, and your first instinct wasn't to stand with me. It was to calculate your share of the loot. You didn't find his will cruel when you were signing the deposit slips for your new SUV and your designer nursery. We deserved that money, she countered. Grandpa wanted us to have it. And I want David to have mine, I replied. It wouldn't be right for you and your sister to receive a massive windfall from me after you already took what should have been mine from my father. You received your inheritance early. You made your choice when you told me that Grandpa just wanted to see his grandbabies set. Well, you're set now. You're successful professionals. You have the Walsh bloodline money. You don't need mine. It's not about the money, Dad. It's about the message. You're telling us we don't matter to you. The message, I said, is that loyalty isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. David earned his place at my table. The veterans' charities earned their place by serving beside me. You stood by and watched while I was publicly humiliated, then offered me 10 grand to keep my mouth shut during probate. You didn't want a father. You wanted a trustee. If you do this, Sarah hissed, her eyes welling with tears of frustration, it's over. You'll be just as alone as Grandpa was at the end. Is that what you want? I'm already 62, Sarah, I said, turning back toward the path. I've spent my life following orders and living a lie to keep people like you and my father comfortable. I'm tired of being the provider who gets kicked in the teeth. If you and Megan want to feel the sting of a diminished inheritance, and let it be a lesson in the cost of silence. You've already been adequately provided for, just like my father wanted. My legacy will go where I am actually respected, not where I am merely tolerated. I didn't wait for her to respond. I started walking back toward the park entrance. I could hear her sobbing behind me, but I didn't turn around. In the military, once a bridge is demolished to prevent an enemy advance, you don't look back at the rubble. You move forward to the next objective. The flight back to Halifax was the quietest 4 hours of my life. I sat in the cabin, looking out at the clouds, feeling a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt since before my father's funeral. I didn't check my phone. I knew what was waiting there. A barrage of texts from Diane and frantic voicemails from Megan. I simply turned the device off. When you're in the middle of a tactical withdrawal, you don't stop to argue with the people who just lost the high ground. When I walked through my front door, David was waiting. He didn't ask how the trip went. He saw the look on my face and simply handed me a glass of water. I told him everything. The walk in the park, Sarah's rage, and the finality of the decision. "Are you sure, Arthur?" he asked softly. "You know they might never forgive you for this." "They didn't forgive me for being who I am in 2006, I replied. "At least this time, I'm the one setting the terms. I'm not waiting for their approval anymore, and I'm certainly not paying for it." The following week was a study in silence. The constant check-in calls from my daughters stopped. The updates about the grandchild ceased. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment my net worth was no longer on their horizon. It was a painful realization, but a necessary one. It confirmed every suspicion I'd had since Miller read that will. I had traded a fake, expensive relationship for a real, quiet peace. I sat in my study, looking at the house I had spent decades paying for. For the first time, it didn't feel like a weight I was holding for the next generation. It felt like home. A year has passed since that walk in High Park. The world didn't end, though for my daughters, the financial landscape certainly shifted. Sarah and Megan have settled into a distant, frosty cordiality. We exchange polite texts on holidays, but the mask of the concerned children has stayed off. Without the carrot of $1 million inheritance dangled in front of them, they no longer feel the need to perform the role of the devoted family. It's a trade I'd make again in a heartbeat. My home in Halifax is now legally protected. David knows that if anything happens to me, he won't be bullied out of his own life by a bloodline that never saw him as a human being. I've also started volunteering with the veterans charity I named in my will. Seeing where that 30% will actually go, to housing and mental health for soldiers who have been discarded by the system, gives me a sense of purpose that my father's legacy never could. I'm no longer an auxiliary character in someone else's greed. I am the architect of my own final chapter. The cracks in the old foundation have been filled with something much stronger than money: truth. I used to believe that blood was the strongest bond on earth, but 24 years in the service and a lifetime of family betrayals taught me otherwise. Blood is just biology. Respect is a choice. My father tried to use his final words to diminish me, but he only succeeded in setting me free. To anyone out there being pressured by tradition to fund people who don't respect your soul, remember that your legacy is yours to define. My daughters have been adequately provided for by the past. My future belongs to the man who loves me and the brothers in arms who stand by me. If you believe that loyalty is earned, not inherited, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button. I'm Arthur Walsh. I'm 62 years old, and for the first time in my life, my orders are my own.